Alright, so we're back at it again with another quick video about the CIA. This time, we're going to be covering Chapter 5, which discusses how the US used covert means to change regimes in other countries. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we jump into this topic, I think it's important that we define what we mean by covert. As you might imagine, this kind of stuff happened covertly, meaning that these actions were not out in the open or public. They were done in secret or hidden from view, hence covert. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain why and how the US government overthrew several governments in Central America and the Caribbean during the Cold War era, and also to explain some of the long-term consequences of these actions. You already know the drill. Let's get to it. So, in order to understand this, we're going to have to pay attention to 3 different countries: Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. Okay, so let's start with Iran. In 1953, the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh got himself elected and then immediately started messing with the US foreign policy interests. First of all, he started by nationalizing the Iranian oil industry, which had previously been owned by the British. And then, after that, he started making friends with the Soviet Union. At this point, it was the late 1950s, and the US was desperate to stop the spread of communism. So when the Iranian Prime Minister started acting like he might be a communist, that was unacceptable. So the US government decided to do something about it. Now, there are a lot of details about this, but what happened was that the CIA worked with some of Iran's army leaders who were unhappy with Mossadegh's leadership, and they staged a coup, basically forcing the prime minister to resign and go into exile. Then, the Shah was put back into power and Iran became an American ally. Now, the problem is that many Iranians felt like this was a betrayal by the United States, and this event in 1953 helped pave the way for the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But more on that in a later video. Anyway, by overthrowing Mossadegh, the US installed a leader who was much more friendly towards the United States and much less friendly towards the Soviet Union. And that was great, because it kept Iran out of the communist sphere and prevented the Soviets from getting access to warm water ports in the Persian Gulf. That's why this is called the Bay of Pigs, because, never mind. But anyway, that was just the first example. There was also the case of Guatemala in 1954. See, in 1951. A democratically elected leader named Jacobo Arbenz came to power in Guatemala and began implementing socialist policies. Again, this was unacceptable because he might turn the country communist. So the CIA worked with some Guatemalan military leaders and some American business people who had an interest in Guatemala's resources, and they staged a coup to overthrow Arbenz. And then, once that happened, they installed a military dictatorship in its place. Now, this was actually an even bigger blow to the US's long-term interest in Latin America, because now it turned out that Guatemala was a failed state controlled by a military junta. It didn't really matter that they were anti-communist, because this created political instability in the region and allowed various criminal organizations to form along the borders, where they could traffic people and smuggle illegal substances across into America. Now, finally, we have Chile in 1973. See, in Chile, there was a democratically elected socialist named Salvador Allende. And while he didn't necessarily belong to the Communist Party, his policies were considered too socialist for the Americans. Plus, he had also nationalized some industries, okay? And so, once again, the CIA got involved and worked with Chilean military leaders to overthrow him. They did this by training the military and funding rebel groups and carrying out acts of sabotage against the Chilean economy. All of this culminated with the CIA working with the Chilean Air Force to bomb the presidential palace and killing Allende in the process. After that, the military leader Pinochet took over and ruled as a dictator until 1990. Now, this was probably the most controversial of the 3 interventions, because Allende was democratically elected and killed in the process. Plus, the CIA was directly involved in planning the coup. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, why couldn't the people in these countries just vote and choose their own leaders without the United States sticking its nose in everybody's business? Well, that's a fair question. And the answer is, well, yes, but no. Yes, these were sovereign nations, and yes, they should have the right to self-determination and make their own decisions about who to elect. And normally, we would say that the U.S. shouldn't interfere in those kinds of things. However, this was a special situation because this was happening during the Cold War, and the United States was genuinely afraid that these countries were going to fall to communism. And this posed a threat to the national security of the United States, not to mention the fact that these governments weren't being overthrown by the CIA in a vacuum. These countries had internal conflicts and tensions that were exploited by the CIA in order to manipulate the public. For example, there were deep divisions between secular governments and the Catholic Church in both Guatemala and Chile. So the CIA played up these tensions to turn the public against the leaders. In Iran, there was tension between the Shah and the people. And so the CIA played into that by spreading propaganda about Mossadegh that painted him as a liar and a hypocrite. Bottom line, the CIA wasn't just going around turning every Latin American country communist. They only did it when there were already signs that a country might go communist anyway. And they thought that they could do it better by staging a coup than letting these countries go through a messy civil war. Also, it should be said that although these leaders were bad for America's interests, the leaders who replaced them were even worse. Iran, under the Shah, became a brutal dictatorship. Guatemala became a brutal dictatorship. And Chile experienced one of the most brutal dictatorships in history under Pinochet. And so the CIA was kind of like the lesser evil option. Like, yeah, it wasn't good to install dictators in these countries, but it was better than letting them become communist. Okay, so that's what it meant when they said that the U.S. pursued a policy of containment. They wanted to contain the spread of communism, and they were willing to do whatever it took to prevent these countries from falling to communism. However, one of the problems with this approach was that these actions often resulted in blowback. Blowback refers to the unintended consequences of these regime change operations. Like, sure, the CIA managed to prevent these countries from becoming communist. However, the governments that replaced them were extremely unpopular, and they led to decades of political instability in each of these regions. Not to mention the fact that these actions undermined the United States' commitment to democracy around the world. Like, if the U.S. was going to go around overthrowing governments that the people had voted into power, then what was stopping other countries from doing the same thing to the United States? That's why some people call this the ugly side of the Cold War, because while the U.S. was preaching democracy abroad, it was actively undermining it in other countries. Okay, this chapter ends here. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.